Chapter 10, Pontius Pilate. Jerusalem was quiet now. No further anti-Roman demonstrations followed the clash over the aqueduct, but deep resentment against Pilate lingered. That this did not ignite sympathy riots elsewhere in Judea was due less to any chastened mood of the Jews than to their greater concern over the Antipas Herodias scandal in Galilee. The smoldering indignation of the people at this notorious misalliance was being fanned into flame by a newly popular desert prophet named John the Baptizer, who was holding forth in the rugged badlands east of Jerusalem toward the Jordan River. John would have escaped Pilate's notice but for two factors which could prove dangerous when combined. First, the man was apparently announcing some oncoming world crisis. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, was his most typical pronouncement in reports Pilate gleaned concerning the wilderness preacher. Second, great numbers of Judeans of all classes were marching out into the desert to hear him. Many were being converted and washed at the Jordan in a purification rite called baptism. Prophets of judgment and doom were familiar enough in Pilate's world. They cluttered public squares from Athenian agora to the Roman Forum. But they had fewer converts. The baptizer, by contrast, was commanding multitudes with his oratory, and the locale was not sophisticated Rome or Greece, but volatile, ever-turbulent Judea. Here, possibly, was another pseudo-messiah in the making, another religio-political troublemaker who could add to the administrative woes of the prefect of Judea. Pilate dispatched an Aramaic-speaking aide down to the Judean wilds to hear John and report back to him on the movement. The intelligence that he provided after his return answered a few questions, but raised so many more that it left Pilate thoroughly perplexed. This John makes no messianic claims for himself, so you can bury your anxiety on that score, the aide told Pilate. One look at the man, of course, would convince anyone that he's not the Jewish Messiah. Hardly, he laughed. He wears a straggly beard and a rough camel skin tunic with a leather belt. I inquired about his background, and it seems he was associated for a while with the Essene monastery just above the asphalt lake. Then he launched out into the wilderness on his own, keeping himself alive on a diet of honeycombs and, would you believe it, insects, locusts. Friend, fried grasshoppers are a delicacy on Roman tables, Pilate advised. It seems your baptizer is something of a primitive gourmet. But how do you know he doesn't have messianic ambitions? Well, while I was there, some priests from Jerusalem asked him about it, and he said, I am not the Messiah. Then they inquired, are you the prophet Elijah? And he said, no. And finally they demanded point blank, who are you then? What do you have to say for yourself? Pilate asked, how did he answer that? Well, he said, I am the voice of the one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. What's that supposed to mean? Pilate asked. That he's the forerunner of the Messiah who's just about ready to appear in Judea. Pilate frowned. How did this news strike the people? Hard to say, said the messenger. Some seem disappointed that John himself was not the Messiah, since he preaches a powerful message and is regarded as a kind of oracle for advice. For instance, some of the pious folks asked him how they ought to live, and he gave them a simple message about sharing. But then some tax collectors also wanted counsel, and he suggested, collect no more than you're due. Would they did just that? Pilate grunted, like, I wish they would only do that. Well, part of our cohort from Antonia was out there to police the crowds, and several of the troops asked John, and we, what shall we do? Pilate moved forward in his chair to catch every syllable of the reply. The baptizer told them, rob no one, either by violence or by fraud. I believe he said, and, oh yes, be content with your wages. By Hercules, that's good advice, Pilate chuckled. I'm beginning to like the baptizer. How did the Jewish authorities react to this fellow? With extreme suspicion, and you can't blame them. When some of the Pharisees and Sadducees came to hear him, this John blasted them with such a verbal assault as I've never heard before. You brood of vipers, he snarled. Who warned you to flee from the approaching wrath? Repent. Brood of vipers, Pilate laughed. A real Demosthenes, some sort of god of some sort, I think. That's about it. Oh, later in Jerusalem, I heard a rumor that the baptizer had actually singled out some Galilean in his crowds as the coming Messiah. What? Any demonstration by the people in support of this Galilean? Nothing I heard about. Pilate paused to think. And John the Baptizer, what, if anything, should we do about him? I think he's moving beyond the Jordan, so we can't touch him. That's Herod Antipas's territory. And even if he stays in Judea, Pilate said, I think we should let him alone. Unless, of course, he raises a sedition. He may but be a good counterpoise to the Jerusalem authorities. The greater the number of divisions among the Jews, the harder it'll be for them to unite against us. Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, Essenes, Essenes, followers of the baptizers. Several more parties wouldn't hurt at all. Pilate reflected, and then he smiled. And John attacks on the tetrarch of Galilee and his beloved Herodias make me look positively virtuous by comparison. As it happened, John the Baptizer was no long-distance critic. Instead of castigating Antipas from the safety of Pilate's Judea, the desert prophet boldly crossed over into the territory of the tetrarch to continue his preaching. During the remainder of the year 29, Roman travelers visiting Caesarea told Pilate of dramatic changes taking place back in Rome. An era had passed, they said, with the death of the aged Empress Mother Livia, wife of Augustus. Surprisingly, Tiberius had not left Capri to attend his own mother's funeral. Public business detained him, he claimed, but all Rome knew that the mother and son had been estranged ever since her attempt to interfere in the affairs of the state. Indeed, many gossiped that Livia herself was the real reason for Tiberius's prolonged sojourn at Capri. Shortly after Livia's death, Pilate was told, the long struggle between Sejanus and Agrippina came to a head. Ever since the Praetorian commander saved his life at the grotto, Tiberius had placed progressively greater confidence in Sejanus, and the after effects of the Sabinus affair now gave him an enormous advantage. Titius Sabinus, a leader of Agrippina's party, had been indicted for plotting to murder Tiberius and raise Agrippina's son to the throne. The Senate ordered the execution of Sabinus, and his corpse was pitched down the stairs of mourning, that steep flight of steps over which bodies of traitors were hurled into the Tiber River. Although there was no proof that Agrippina and her son Nero, this is not the future Emperor Nero, a different Nero, were implicated in the plot, Tiberius added to the climate of suspicion by sending the Senate a letter which faulted Agrippina for pride and arrogance and accused Nero of homosexuality and profligacy, I don't know that word, Profligacy. Since the letter contained no direct charge of treason, the Senate found itself in a terrible dilemma. Any motion of censure would be a mortal offense to Nero, the heir apparent, while failure to act would antagonize the reigning emperor. During the debate, the Senate House was surrounded by a mob, which brandished images of Agrippina and her son, pleaded for their safety, and shouted that the princeps' letter was a forgery. The demonstration turned into a riot, which cowed the Senate into dispersing without acting on Tiberius's communication. At that report, Pilate derived a bit of comfort from the fact that he was not the only Roman magistrate to face angry crowds. Misery loves company, is what I would say. Sejanus, of course, quickly mastered the situation with his praetorians, but warned Tiberius that sedition was in the air and that a coup in favor of his adoptive daughter-in-law and grandson was possible. The emperor dispatched an angry missive to the Senate, rebuking the Roman rabble for disloyalty and calling the Senate's temporizing an insult to the imperial majesty. Senators, in fright, hastened to fall in line. They vied with one another in a scramble to introduce motions declaring Agrippina and Nero public enemies. The decrees passed unanimously, leaving their punishment up to the emperor. Tiberius soon banished Agrippina to Pandataria and Nero to Pontia. Both were islands, some 35 miles off the Italian coast near the grotto. Sejanus had triumphed. News of these events relieved Pontius Pilate, since his very career was stalked to Sejanus' success. Had Agrippina been victorious and Sejanus been exiled, all of Tiberius' appointments, which had been made with the advice of the fallen prefect, would likely have lapsed. Pilate would have been recalled. At best, his political career would have been at an end. At worst, if Agrippina wished to institute a vindictive purge, he might well have shared in Sejanus' disgrace and exile. Early the next year, news of Sejanus' further success reached Caesarea. The Senate had continued its campaign against the house of Agrippina by pronouncing another of her sons a public enemy. And the youth, Drusus, was imprisoned in an underground chamber at the Palatine Palace. Romans now ventured to speak openly of Sejanus as virtual successor to the imperial throne, since only one son of Agrippina remained, Gaius, whose name was also Caligula. But he was barely 18, and if he proved disloyal and went the way of his brothers, it would be Emperor Sejanus, pure and simple. Throughout 30 AD, successive reports reaching Pilate added brushstrokes to the portrait of Sejanus' prospects. The Senate voted that his birthday should be a public celebration, and gilded statues of him were appearing throughout Rome. So remember, Sejanus is under Tiberius, but he's starting to get very popular. Whenever public officials consulted Tiberius, they now always consulted Sejanus as well. His mansion was besieged with delegations. Public prayers and sacrifices were offered in behalf of Tiberius and Sejanus. Pilate peered into his own future, quaffing the news from Rome like heady wine. He reckoned himself in the inner circle of Sejanus' closest political adherents. And had not the prefect personally promised greater honors if he proved himself in Judea? Sejanus had climbed the Praetorian stairs to success, a route similar to his own. And what would be more natural for Sejanus as emperor than to extend a helping hand to one who was standing where he once stood? What appointment would Sejanus give him after Judea? Another province, perhaps Egypt? More likely one of the major administrative posts in Roman government. Sejanus would want to be surrounded by his own men. Nearly any office would be open to Pilate, including the privilege of sitting in the Senate, or even that proven springboard to limitless power, Praetorian prefect, vice emperor of Rome. Or was he fooling himself? How high did he really rank in Sejanus' favor? Would Sejanus' accession actually spell his own advancement? With a twinge of regret, Pilate recalled how Sejanus had criticized his handling of the Standards episode. But surely his firmness during the aqueduct riot more than counterbalanced any image of a weak Pilate Sejanus might have conjured up for himself. Indeed, Sejanus had reacted to Pilate's report of the aqueduct argument with enthusiastic approval of his use of force. His only regret, in fact, was that many more rioters had not been killed as a standing object lesson to any would-be Jewish revolutionaries. Pilate noticed that the anti-Semitic streak in Sejanus was now blossoming into a full-blown hatred of the Jews, magnified also by the burning glass of political hostility, for many Jews had supported Agrippina's Julian party in tribute to Caesar's memory. According to reports, the Roman Jews, in turn, were becoming thoroughly alarmed at Sejanus' continuing triumphs. Pilate had a different cause for concern. Sejanus had not written him in months. All this information was coming from unofficial sources. But one day, finally, a Praetorian courier delivered a communication which was virtually imprisoned under heavy seals. Pilate whittled away at them with his dagger, and then he read. And here is the letter from Sejanus to Pontius Pilate. It says, "Greeting. The task of securing Rome against our enemies must excuse my interrupted correspondence. By now you must have heard that victory is ours. Does this mean we can relax our guard? That gods forbid. The princeps hints that he may pardon the sons of Agrippina. And who is the enemy which silently plots my destruction and secretly assists the cause of Agrippina? The Jews of Rome. Here, I think, is their line of communication. The Jews contact members of Herod's house living here in Rome, particularly Berenice. She is the mother of that Herodias whom you wrote about, the one who recently married Herod Antipas. And Berenice has the ear of Lady Antonia, Mark Antony's daughter and sister-in-law of Tiberius, who has access to the princeps. And what message runs from the Jews to Berenice, to Antonia, to Tiberius? Sejanus is a danger to the state. I have warned the Jewish leaders in the Trans-Tiber that I will no longer tolerate their schemes against the state. In reprisal, you must now move to restrict the Judean authorities in some way. Write me what specific measures you will undertake. My reasoning should be obvious. Pressure on Judaism is applied much more effectively at the heart than at the extremities. How far has your project of Romanizing the Jews proceeded? Not far, I fear, but you had set yourself a virtually impossible task to begin with. Continue firm in Judea, Pilate, and you will have an auspicious future. Farewell." Pilate was perplexed by the letter, if not alarmed. Small wonder it had been sealed so tightly. Never before had Sejanus betrayed such emotional anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness. Although he was anything but a pro-Jewish partisan, Pilate wondered if Sejanus was justified in ascribing all of his woes to the Jews of Rome. He found several glaring chinks in Sejanus' logic. If, indeed, the Jews had used a Berenice Antonio Tiberius route for attacking him, it might only have been in defense against Sejanus' prior attacks on them. Even more likely would be Antonia's own version to Sejanus. Agrippina, after all, was her daughter-in-law. It would hardly take a Berenice to suggest to her that the Praetorian prefect was ruining her family. Fulfilling the directives in Sejanus' letter would be difficult, but there was no alternative to compliance. The idea of some restriction on the local Jewish leadership might be feasible. It might also prove disastrous to the peace of the land. It would have to be some token which looked big to Rome, but was not that fundamentally important to the Sanhedrin, Pilate decided. He took his clue from a curious custom regarding the robes of the high priest. In order to control the Jewish priesthood, Herod had gained custody of the sacred vestments, and Rome succeeded Herod in that prerogative. Worn by the pontiff only 4 times a year at major festivals, the robes were locked in the Antonia until the feast approached, when they were given back to the priest, who had to return them immediately afterward. It was a token of Roman supremacy which had never sparked a riot. Pilate looked for a similar symbolic restriction of the Sanhedrin. He found it in the jus gladi, the law of the sword, the right to execute in cases of capital punishment. Until now, the great Sanhedrin had full authority to conduct trials and execute sentences for capital crimes perpetrated by Jews in Judea. To implement Sejanus' directives, Pilate now planned to withdraw from the Sanhedrin the right of execution and add it to the jus gladi, already possessed by the Roman prefect. From now on, the Sanhedrin could continue to try Jews in capital cases, even find them worthy of death, but the actual sentencing and execution would have to be carried out by the prefect of Judea. Pilate was pleased with the idea. In Roman eyes, nothing showed sovereignty so much as the right to control sentences of death. He could easily play his way up in his report and so satisfy Sejanus. As to Jewish feelings in the matter, he could assure the Sanhedrin that their right to try capital crimes was not grossly affected, since the prefect would usually confirm the sentence determined by them. It might actually be a convenience to the Jewish authorities, since the nasty business of execution would be taken out of their hands. During his visit to Jerusalem at the Passover of 30, Pilate discussed his planned revision with Caiaphas, confiding to him the pressures from Sejanus which had prompted the change, and as diplomatically as he could, he gave the high priest no choice but to accept. Caiaphas brought the news to the Sanhedrin, and fully a week passed before he reported their reaction. They had grudgingly accepted, but with the stipulation that Pilate and his successors never alter their verdict in a capital case. Pilate said he would discuss that proviso with his superiors. At any rate, in symbolic response to the new limitation, the Sanhedrin ceased meeting in the hall of hewn stone near the inner temple, their Senate chamber, as constricted leaders of the Jewish nation, and moved to the Market of Annas, farther over on the Temple Mount. Pilate tried to sweeten the pill by granting a Jewish request that he release one prisoner chosen by the people at each Passover, a festival amnesty which was unparalleled in the Roman Empire, but a concession with no great implications. That is the end of chapter 10. If you had a little trouble following exactly what was happening with the political situation at the time, don't panic. Just remember that Sejanus is getting more power, and Pilate is tumultuously underneath Sejanus, sort of wondering what that will mean for him. And Tiberius is over Sejanus, and that's all going to kind of come to a head here, which is actually going to affect Christ's crucifixion.